Good morning, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Branding Blueprint, where we like to discuss product innovation, product development, and product scaling, understanding market trends, and making better decisions for your business and your brand in general. Today's discussion is on biases. Recently, biases came up in some discussions, especially in a critical thinking seminar that I went to. And there are quite a few biases, and I thought it might be nice to actually discuss them so that when we are in a business or a product scenario, we are aware of our own shortcomings and to prevent ourselves from having biases. Some of these are very prevalent, and a lot of them, I think actually all of them, I've come across in a lot of different industries and a lot of different teams. Um, and this is not going to fit into a single discussion point. So I think I'll break it up a bit and take a look at some examples of each bias. So to start off the list, we have quite a serious one, and one that can be very prevalent, even though people don't always realize it. It's one of the trickier ones to spot, and it's called confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is when you sort of favor and filter information to support your narrative, to support your idea. And it's a useful tool when presenting information. I've manipulated confirmation bias, the concept of it, to make presentations and discussions go in certain directions. For instance, it's a long example, but if anyone's curious, I'll guess I can do a discussion on it. But it's essentially, you don't mention what you don't want to talk about. It's as simple as that. Um, but in terms of confirmation bias, and where it starts harming the business, right, is when you ignore information that contradicts existing beliefs or hypotheses. Um, a common example is when people ignore negative feedback about a product and they say, "Oh, but this user or this person is an exception. There isn't a problem. This is an exception. It's a edge case. Is the word you often hear thrown around, edge cases." And especially when a bunch of them pop up, and then people tend to ignore them or they tend to not report on them, and they think, "Oh, but there's some other glitch in the system." And this type of bias, it stumps creating a product for the audience, for the users, where instead you're now creating a product for you. And that's not it's not a good way to do product or to build a business in general. And it's very prevalent. It's very tricky to spot because at some point, like, you do get edge cases, you do, and you do get abnormalities, and sometimes you get pockets in your audience that tend to go one direction, but your main market goes the other direction. And you can make an informed decision whether, are you going to cater for this small pocket, or are you not? Is it not worth the development time? It's not worth the man hours to spend on it. But it's important to know that when you make decisions that you regard it truly, and that you're not being biased and turning a blind eye to other information. It's really quite prevalent. Another example that very often comes, I think, especially with startups, it can be quite prevalent in my experience. It's called the anchoring bias. And the anchoring bias is when people, they rely very heavily, or they anchor themselves on the first piece of information or experience. And they regard this as true. They're like, "No, but I guess a good example, it might not actually be a good example, but an example is if you go to a restaurant and you eat bad food. Now you're convinced that food is terrible. But some of the evidence might be that the head chef or the usual chef was off sick or was on leave and had a substitute. or that there was another fault and that you use some other equipment. There's other evidence can be used, but you're anchoring yourself to this information, this perspective that the food is bad. And anchoring yourself in this perspective is not necessarily wrong. I think it's not ideal, and I don't think it's ideal for uh, a self-intelligent and introspective, introspective. Sorry. English is not my first language. If you guys couldn't hear from my accent, introspective individual, someone who looks within. But if each to his own. But when we run a business or build a product, we're doing so for ideally for the common good, for other people, and you kind of have to sacrifice setting yourself in a certain perspective, and that's where the anchor bias is very dangerous. In business setting, if the waiter example is a little bit too mundane or too practical, in a business setting, it's very often related to price, where price is associated with the worth of a product, and when people anchor themselves on the price or the supply or demand, the how much product is bought goes down, then people are like, it cannot be the price. The price is right. Um, we need to make our certain profits. The price is right. It's our value. Um, and that it can be detrimental, right? It can blind you from looking to other avenues of increasing revenue, decreasing expenses in general. Um, while I don't have an example now ready for me of a company that did not do it, what I do have is an example of a country that did it very well, or that avoided this bias very well. And I think it was actually a podcast that I listened to quite a while ago. I think it was a podcast, it might have been a YouTube video. I don't think it was a book or a seminar about Adobe, the company that makes like Photoshop and After Effects. In case you don't know, or a lot of people are very familiar with their PDF reader, Adobe PDF. Where they did it very well, where they avoided this bias, where they adapted to the market and became a subscription basis. And I remember there was a discussion of how they did it very, very cleverly, where they sort of started shifting people towards the subscription model, by making it not just more affordable, but in the way they presented it, they guided it, and they realized they couldn't be biased and stick to the old model where it was buy once for a lifetime. Where anchoring bias would be, okay, no, this is anchor, this has worked for us now, this is what we regard as our keystone. So we're going to stay with it. And it's a very dangerous position for a company, especially in evolving markets like technology, to be in and to avoid. In some other talks, I kind of like booked out my entire Saturday to do some of these videos, or podcasts at least. I want to talk a bit further more into some of the biases. So some of the ones we're still going to discuss is I wanted to mention the overconfidence bias, which is also very prevalent, and go into a bit deeper things like the availability heuristic, loss aversion, and sunk cost fallacy. I think can be a discussion on its own, because sunk cost fallacy has a lot of different masks it wears, and it is extremely prevalent, and it's not a one case fits all. There's certain nuances to sunk cost fallacy where companies they go on. It's not always about continuing work on a doomed product. Sometimes it's continuing work on a succeeding product, but refusing to adapt or to simplify out of fear, which it also links a lot into loss aversion, but it's a little bit different.